Greetings of the day, everyone. I'm privileged to welcome you all into the third edition of Orange City Literature Festival, organized by SDR Knowledge Foundation in association with GH Racine University, powered by Racine Group of Institutions. I'm Amit Jangde, delighted to be your anchor for today's session on Liver Migration to Arab Gulf by Rajamon Kottappan sir in conversation with Advocate Rucha Pandey. Rajamon Kottappan sir is an independent journalist and a migrant rights defender. He was chief reporter for the Times of Oman until he was deported back to India in 2017 for exposing human trafficking and modern slavery in the Arab Gulf through a front page news story. Rajamon sir now writes for the Thomas Reuters Foundation, TRF, Equal Times, Migrant Rights, Middle East Eye, The Hindu, Times of India, Kawa, Wire, The Leaflet, and various other Indian news portals. He has done two media fellowships, one with the International Labour Organization ILO on labor organization, one each with TRF and National Foundation of India NFI on forced labor and Gulf migration, respectively. Sir is also a researcher for the Migrant Forum in Asia and has worked as a consultant for the ILO and International Trade Union Confederation ITUC. In 2019, he authored an anthology, Rowing Between Rooftops, The Heroic Fishermen of Kerala Floods, telling the stories of heroic fishermen who rescued thousands from the 2018 Kerala floods. Rajaman sir belongs to the Pannan Dalit community of Kerala. Historically, Pannans were ballet singers who narrated the acts of the then great warriors and kings. He wishes to continue this storytelling legacy through his books and writing. It's an honor to have you with us, Mr. Rajaman Kottappan sir, and this gets even more delightful as we have Advocate Rucha Pandey, who will be in conversation with him as the moderator. Rucha Pandey is a practicing advocate at Supreme Court of India. She has worked as an activist and advocate with Human Rights and Law Defenders, Pune. She started practicing law at Bombay High Court Nagpur bench since 2016. She graduated from the Hidyutala National Law University, Raipur. She earned a BA LLB honors degree in the year 2015, completing the honors program in constitutional law and international trade law. I once again welcome you, sir, and I welcome you, ma'am. Now, my dear audience, you are about to experience a conversation between two very dynamic individuals. So, without skipping a moment, I humbly invite Advocate Richa Pandey to lead us ahead. Ma'am, please.
Hello. So, Amir, that was indeed a wonderful introduction, and it's sheer privilege that I'm here and I'm going to converse with Regimon sir. So, when I read about Regimon sir and his work and everything, I was really startled. I mean, the expanse of his work and the exemplary effect, not just somebody who's researching, who's going around talking to people, but or let's say who is an encyclopedia of data. But Regimon sir is actually somebody who has worked on the field. So here we are going to talk to somebody who has been there. So now I think let's hear it from the horse's mouth. If that's I think the best way to describe him. So when all of us who read, we know that when sometimes when we read an article or a book, it feels sometimes that the author is actually talking to us. So that shows the involvement of the author, how much he has worked on it. So I got that kind of an experience while I was reading what Regimon sir has written. So let me first start by talking about his book, Rowing Between the Rooftops. Now, Rowing Between the Rooftops is a wonderful book that is highly recommended for everybody. Now, 2018 saw a terrible catastrophic floods in Kerala, and this is when all the Kerala fishermen, they jumped in and they saved their folks. The thousands of people and property and animals were saved because of the heroic efforts of these fishermen. They literally brought out their boats and they saved people. And Regimon sir has documented this. He has spoken to him, and the interaction I'm sure he had while doing this was superb. So one should read his book for that. Now, coming to today's topic, that is, as we all know, labor migration to Arab Gulf, which is Regimon sir's expert topic, and he has been through it. He has seen it all from the very close quarters. So now let's talk to him about that. And to begin with, I'll start by quoting the title of his book, Undocumented Stories of Indian Migrants in the Arab, that he has written very beautifully. And there are so many gut-wrenching stories in that. So now let's talk to sir about that. Now, before we begin, I'll just like to give a little brief introduction about what this entire crisis is. So as we all know that around 23 million migrants are there in the Arab countries, and out of that 9 million are from India. So 90 lakhs, that's a huge population. And these are not just people who are migrating from one country to another country for work. These are real people with real rights, privileges, and duties and protection that not just their own country should give them, but also the country that they are going to, that must give these people. So they should feel protected. But unfortunately, so as we can see, we saw in our country when the COVID pandemic broke out, that these privileges were kind of seen to be snatched away from these people. Do they even have it? Was a question that popped in most of our heads. So, what about people who leave their country for work? Do they even feel the protective cover? Or let me ask that, do they even have the protective cover? Is the question. And Regimon sir, as we all know, is an expert in that. So now let's hear it from the man himself and the person who has been on the field throughout. So Regimon sir, please take us through all these, the stories, the interactions, the experiences you have had while writing this book, and all that you can share with us, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Rucha. And let's stop that I'm Reggie. People call me Reggie. It's not Regimon sir and all. So let's be more casual. Thanks for this wonderful opportunity. Yeah, like any other care light, I also migrated to Gulf. So it happened because in Kerala the unemployment is too high, and to get a job is very quite difficult. So we always look at getting opportunities in the Arab Gulf countries where the petrodollars are there. And every fifth house in Kerala, there would be a migrant worker. Migrant worker in the sense who somebody will be there in Arab Gulf or Europe or America. We don't migrate to Southeast Asia and all. That was before 1950s and all. We used to move to Java, Burma, Japan, those kind of. But after the oil was found in 1960s and all, our destination became the Gulf countries, and a few educated nurses and engineers migrate to Germany, Europe, America, and all. So, as I said, every fifth house there is a migrant. I also migrated after getting a job here in Indian Express. When my senior wanted me to join him while he was migrating, and he told me that you are going to get a huge salary raise, so you can join me. So, to learn some more experiences and to see new places, I migrated. And when I reached there, I had to learn a lot, relearn a lot, and understand a lot. Till then, I didn't know that there are Indian migrants who are being exploited, abused, and they are working under harsh conditions like slaves. I didn't know that. Never I have heard of that kind of stories also. That's why my book is titled Undocumented. These stories are not documented anywhere. These stories are not told anywhere. And that's why I have written in the book that these are unheard and untold stories, because we always hear about the success stories only, that too in glossy magazines. All the big Indian rich businessmen who have minted money, who are on the Forbes list, who are on the rich list and all, who have made success. But out of the 90 lakh Indians in the Arab Gulf country plus the Jordan and Lebanon, I can confirm that more than 80 lakh are blue collar workers or workers who are paid below 30,000 or 35,000 per month. So these kind of workers face a different kind of challenge, because in the Arab Gulf countries, still since the 1960s, they follow a different kind of employer-employee system called kafala. It's not written anywhere. It's not a rule. It's not a law, and it's not a Sharia thing also. And it's not a Sharia thing also, because the Arab trade unions, there are only two trade unions in two countries, that's in Bahrain and Oman. There are only two trade unions. And these trade union people also tell me that this is a thing which we have to get rid of from our country, the kafala, where it spoils the relationship between the employee and employer, and it keeps the worker, the migrant worker, as bonded labor. You don't have the right to right to associate. You don't have the freedom of expression. You don't have your movement of restriction gets movement of your freedom of movement get restricted. Basically, you are tied up to the worker, and these kind of workers, when they are tied up to the employee, then it's a big challenge. Any kind of emergency back home, you don't get a leave to go home. Any kind of difficulty you have at workplace that don't get resolved. Any kind of violations happen, you don't have a right to question it. Whatever the employer says, you have to obey it. And definitely, I was surprised to know that majority of the big businesses done in the Gulf country are run by Indian management and Indian businessmen. And these are the Indian businessmen and the successful people who recruit Indian migrants to the Gulf countries. And they themselves exploit their brothers and sisters. And it's not, I won't blame the Arab countries. It's we who are teaching them how to exploit our own brothers and sisters. So I wanted to tell their stories. I tried my maximum to tell with the limited freedom of expression which is available in the monarchy countries like Gulf countries, but I couldn't tell all the stories. And between I migrated in 2006 last, and I was deported in 2017 April for exposing human trafficking. But I saved a few stories. Returning back India, I started to think about the story, start writing the stories and all. And finally, this November 15, it has come out as a book. Uh, my stories, I won't say that these are the greatest stories. I won't say, because these are the people whom I met who were in a bad situation. But I still know that there are more people who are in a worse situation. Yesterday, I came to know that there are 900 Indian workers in a company stranded for 20 months without pay, proper food, proper shelter. And they're still stranded. And day before yesterday, I got a case from Oman saying that there is a person who is undocumented for the last 32 years, and the Indian embassy and the Oman government is struggling to make a paper to repatriate him back home. So think about I told a story about a person who was stranded for 22 years. Definitely, this person who is stranded for 32 years in a foreign country would have a very worse, bad story to say than the other guy. So these are not the greatest stories, but nobody even have told these stories also. Everybody talks about only success. Everybody talks about only relations, brotherhood, mutual understanding, those kind of things. But nobody tells any real stories. There we won't be able to do it because the freedom of expression is very limited and the media freedom is very limited. So we won't be able to do that. So that's why I thought of writing this book and tell the people that yes, boss, there is a different kind of life in labor migration happening in the Arab Gulf, especially in the Arab Gulf because the exploitative kafala system is going on there.
Sir, so while you were on this journey of writing this book, what other stories or any other special experiences or interactions you've had? Could you please share some with us?
Yeah, and this book tells about eight people's stories. So it all starts from 1960. A person who went to migrated to Gulf on an illegal though from Daman Diu, which was a Persian though, and he was at the age of 14 when he migrated to Dubai. And he didn't reach Dubai; he reached Muscat, and from there, on a jeep, he went to Dubai, and he built the Dubai Creek and all. At that time, in 1960s, there was no Dubai, and it was not possible to move around Dubai to Abu Dhabi to Sharjah. These are all were different countries, and later on they joined together, like Indian states become an Indian republic. These UAE Emirates become an UAE Emirate later, and from there the story moves to labor migrant. This guy also was a labor migrant, and again it moves to a labor migrant who got stranded for 22 years. Then it moves to another guy who didn't have enough valid documents to come back in a regular way from Oman to India. So he took the help of Pakistani and Bangladeshi traffickers to cross the Oman UAE border mountains, which is a very risky thing. And if you get caught, you get shot dead. So he crossed there and he appeared himself. He put himself in the front of the embassy saying that I came to UAE and I got stranded. I don't know where my employer is, so I want to go back to India. And at that time, there was an amnesty going on. Amnesty is a system, is a sort of program announced every 2 year or 3 year by an Arab country, allowing the overstaying labor migrants to leave that country without paying a fine. without paying an overstaying fine. When I say overstaying fine, you should understand if you overstay for 1 year, the fine would be 1.2 lakh or 1.3 lakh something. So the story moves to that guy, his experiences, and then it moves to another character called Sushmita, who was trafficked from Bihar to UAE, and then from trafficked from there to Oman, and she was confined in a mansion, and she was sexually abused and all. And I rescued her, and I knew the route, what it was happening, and all. So I rescued her. Then it moves on to another story. A mother and a child who was a child, and she couldn't prove that he's Indian. Indian embassy also couldn't manage to prove that that boy is an Indian, because she was undocumented when she delivered the baby, and the baby was now 6 years old, and the baby was a undocumented baby. And for the mother, the Indian embassy was okay that we can talk to the district collector in India and get a certificate that she's an Indian. But how could I prove that this boy is an Indian? So I told the official that the boy speaks Malayalam. He all of a sudden he replied that even Pakistanis speak Malayalam, and that's a true thing also, because Malayalam is the most common language in the Gulf. Arabs speak, Pakistanis speak, yeah, all the North Indians also speak Malayalam in Gulf countries, because we are large in numbers there. We run the tea shops, we run the shopping malls, we run the offices, we run the taxis and everything. So that's the thing. And then the story comes to COVID and that everything. All these stories I'm talking about undocumented people who either by design or by fate get undocumented, and they struggle for their life, and when they want to come back also, they won't be able to come back if they can't prove that they are Indian. In this, the most troublesome and the most risky one was rescuing Sushmita from that mansion, because she, you should understand that a domestic worker, she won't get access to phone, and you don't get access to go out always, and you will be always in the kitchen, and you may have to work for some 14 hours or something every day. And and there won't be any Wi-Fi. Even the house master will switch off the Wi-Fi if she's using a phone. So how could she communicate to me? One day, what she did is that she was sexually abused many times at that house. So one day she always peeps through a window on the second floor of the house, and she can see that at certain time a person is passing through an alley there. So what she did is that she wrote her number in Malayalam, that I have to be rescued, and she wrote her number and threw it down. This boy took that number. He didn't do anything. He took it and he didn't stare even at her, because he knows that that is very risky. Next day, he handed over the paper to a supermarket salesman who knew me, who called me and told that we have got a number and this is the location. So what can we do? I talked to the embassy. Embassy then told that, okay, Reggie, embassies cannot directly intervene into this, get into this kind of a rescue operations, all because it's all will become a protocol violation. So usually we do that on behalf of embassy. And when after in a week, I started to talk to her when she was available to talk, and she will be able to talk to me only 3 a.m. in the morning, when these house people will go for prayers to the mosque and all. She will be able to switch on the Wi-Fi and she will be able to talk to me, and that too for 10 minutes or something. That's it. And at that time, I should be awake. And finally, we fixed the day and we went there early morning, 3 o'clock. She told me that when she comes out to put the garbage in the garbage bin, she will get into my car. My friend went there, but she didn't come, and it took and at around 10 o'clock early morning, and not in the morning 10 o'clock, 7 hours we had to roam in that city. 10 o'clock she came, and we picked her. While coming back, I was picked by the police, because I have a in the Arab countries you cannot have a lady who is not a relative or your office colleague in your car. So I was picked up by the police. Then the embassy intervened and all. I was released, and she was also taken to the embassy and all. And that trip was very much risky. And we have done a lot like that. Many rescues have been done.
So now, sir, these were these heroic stories where the experiences you have had. Now we want to know, when in 2017 you yourself were accosted you were deported. We want to know about that, how you handled all of that, how.
Yeah, see, since 2014, the oil price started to slide, and it came down to $10 per barrel and all. So all the Arab countries were in lot of pressure, economy pressure and all, and they started to sell the sovereign wealth fund and all. Whenever there is a crisis in Arab Gulf country, the first casualty will be the migrant workers, the laborers, the low-level workers, or the mid-level workers. The top-level workers never will lose their job; they will be safe. Even they will not be sent off. Their salaries will be cut down by 20%, 30%. But first they will do is that they'll fire the workers, they fire the blue collar workers, because the projects get halted. There is no work, there is no road building, there is no building work happening, no construction, no gardening, nothing. So you don't want to keep them, so you will fire them. But what happened is that when the oil crisis happened and when the economy fell down, the workers were laid off, but they were not paid properly. Their end of service benefits were not paid, and their pending wages were not paid, and they were left in lurch in the camps. And I have done a lot of stories like 1,000 workers stranded in a camp. They are depending on what you get the waste meat from the butchery shop. You get the waste meat. They buy those waste meat and just put some turmeric powder and salt and cook it and eat, just to be alive, just to be alive. I reported those kind of big stories in a camp. I went there, I saw this, and I was very much worried and agitated and all. So when I started to do that kind of stories, those stories got debated in the parliament, because in an Arab country nobody does any migrant worker stories. So these stories were front page stories. So those stories got debated in the parliament, and some positive policy changes were happening. But these big stories brought me under the radar of the Oman government. So I was under the radar. And then after that, the trafficking issues, I used to be into the rescue operations. I used to attend the Indian Embassy open houses. I used to listen to the rescued domestic worker stories. And they sometimes they don't want to be rescued. Sometimes they need only some dress or money or food or something. That's what they need. I used to arrange that. So these interactions prompted me to map the route of trafficking, because the rescued women, by coming back to the embassy, she would tell me how she came, who was the agent, where she was sold and all. So finally I decided that let me route map the trafficking. So I went to the Oman UAE border, where the manpower supply agents will sell the girls without the knowledge of Indian embassy or any other Asian embassies. And according to them, everything is very clear, because to UAE, you can any woman can get a visa. She can go there. And if it is a visit visa, it is just for 45 days. After 45th day, they don't mind whether you are going to Oman or back to India. They won't ask. By the time the agent will give a job visa for this domestic worker there in the UAE, she will show this UAE Oman job visa, and she will by road she will come to Oman, and she will be kept in the manpower supply agent. And if I am an Arab and I'm eligible for a domestic worker visa, and I will get the visa from the Oman government, I will give the visa to the manpower supply agent. So everything is legal. But what is illegal is that without the knowledge of Indian embassy, an Indian woman is being trafficked to UAE, brought into Oman, and without any proper legal documents or something like that, without the job contract or anything like that, she is being put into a house as a domestic worker. So I wanted to route map it. I did a sting operation, and the story got published in 2016 October. When I did that sting operation, most of the domestic workers were Sri Lankan domestic workers, and there were only a few Indian domestic workers. The Sri Lankan government was very much unhappy seeing the story. They directly called me and asked me, "Hey, Raji, what is happening?" So I said, "This is what happening." So they said, "We will talk to the Oman government. This is not supposed to have happened there." So they talked to the Oman government. So on a story, a foreign country is calling Oman government and talking to them and asking them what is happening on the ground. So this was an unhappy turnout for the Oman government. So, and we had a follow-up story also. The Sri Lankan government wrote a letter, and they wanted to cancel all the MOUs or something like that and all. And we did a follow. The country. They told me that you are a migrant rights activist, you are a human rights activist, you are not a journalist. We don't want you to be here. And I had a Ministry of Information accreditation card. I was an accredited journalist. Out of the 100 journalists, there were only 8 journalists who had the accreditation card, and I was one among them. But still, that didn't save my job. And within 15 days, I had to leave the country. My children were studying there. My wife was with me. I had to pull out them from the school, and empty-handed, I came back without any job or anything. I came back. So this is what that.
Now, sir, this is you have seen really that must have been a very terrible time. But so when I read your story about rescuing the when fishermen in Iran were stuck due to COVID pandemic, so many Indian fishermen. So what is the story about that? Your reporting and
That
experiences.
was during COVID. It happened. I got a call from the Catholic Bishop Church where the bishop resides. I got a call from a sister. They all are connected to me because all kind of sort of a rescue mission, grievance at a redressal mission. I know a few ambassadors. I know the way how to operate it. I know whom to talk. I know how to prepare an application. So people called me. They called me and told that. And this was the first case for me in 2020 COVID. First case. It was the end of February, I think so, 27th February 2020. They called me late night, 10 o'clock, and told me that, Rajiv, we heard that some Indian fishermen are stranded in the Iranian coast. It is in Bandar Abbas and along the Iranian
Since
coast. Not
many fishermen were stuck there, right?
Yes,
Many
the
fishermen,
many fishermen. There were 700 fishermen. But first
700.
we came to know that only 60 fishermen. And the 60 fishermen were from Kerala. They were from the southern tip of Kerala. They called the bishop of somehow. And because the church has a good rapport with the fishermen community here, like anywhere else. So they called and they told. And I got only 60 fishermen. And late night, 1 o'clock early morning, they called me. I told the church to give my number, let me talk to them. I didn't think that it was a serious issue, and nobody thought that COVID is going to be a big issue also. Everybody heard about a Wuhan case, then an Iran case, and Iran didn't close down its borders also. Iran didn't close down its borders also. It was very in a pre-stage when the COVID was spreading there. But these fishermen were worried because if they wanted to leave Iran before Iran closes its border and before India and other countries stops its air operations. They wanted that, but it didn't happen. Next early morning, 1 o'clock, they called me. They said, we are not getting food from the city, from Tehran. Our employer is not coming. He's not sending any money. We are stranded here. We don't have any Wi-Fi. We don't have any phone call, nothing. And we are in the boat. I asked them how many. We know 60. I said, prepare a list. Check with your friends and all. And the next day morning, they came out with a list of 300. And they told me that we don't have food for the last 3 days. Then I wrote a story. I got it published in a small website called The Lead in Chennai. And luckily, Sashi Tharoor saw that story. He retweeted the story, and I emailed him a request also saying that these guys are starving there. So he had his friend Javed Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, was a colleague with him in UN. So he wrote to Javed Zarif, and Javed Zarif contacted the Indian embassy, and Indian embassy stepped in, and they started to supply food and everything. But this happened in February. You should think that this happened in February, and these poor guys came back only in June end when 2 Indian ships were sent from here to bring them back. And by that time, there were 700 people, 720 fishermen who boarded that ship and came back. And I prepared that 720. Myself and my friend Mini Mohan, we both talked to them and collected them and made the Excel sheet. And I coordinated it with the minister V Muralidharan. He even also was calling me at that time and all, and we coordinated and everything through the church, through the minister, through Sashi Tharoor. Everybody got into this issue, and finally those 720 fishermen came back, and they came to my home and all with all dried fish and all, with a big packet of dried fish and all. And nowadays, whenever there are marriages happening there, they will call me, and I myself and my wife go there. And I have a good name among them also, because I wrote a book about them also long back in 2019. So they know my name, and so now they always say that you should come and stand in election here.
Well, I'm going to talk about the book. I'm going to make you talk about the book because that's a highly intriguing book. And I'm sure there are several experiences you've had with these fishermen. after the floods.
Yeah,
Now, there's
yeah,
one important thing that I really want to talk when it comes to Arab migration first. Now, when these people will come back, like we saw it in COVID, so the repatriation will happen. What should the Indian government do? What should these people do? And what
yeah,
do
yeah,
you think as a scholar that needs to be
yeah,
done?
yeah. That's a very burning issue because see, such kind of crisis happen on and off. In 2018, also there was a real estate crisis happened in Dubai when many people lost their job. 2014 oil crisis happened, and after 6 years, exactly after 6 years, that is 2020, we had COVID also. So people will return, and it keeps on changing. The trend keeps on changing. Sometimes if it is job loss in Gulf, sometimes it's job loss in Southeast Asia or somewhere else. You know, the H-1B visa, those kind of things and all happen. Why I talk about the Gulf countries, because these are semi-skilled job seekers and those who work there and all. Labor migrants, large numbers going. So that is why a migrant coming back from India, America, I won't be much worried about it because he's a skilled migrant. He can come back and he can find a job here also. But about a labor migrant who has gone to Gulf, he would have worked there for 10 years and he migrates at the age of 20 and he works there for 10 years or 15 years and he comes back empty handed when there is a crisis and all, giving up his end of service benefit and pending salary. He is at the age of 35. Where is the job here back in India? At the age of 35, would you get a job? There are fresh people, fresh students out from the college to ready to work for 10,000 rupees. Ready to work for 10,000 rupees per month or below that also. You know how the gig economy is picking up. It's just only because unemployment is very high. People are moving into gig economy like delivery boys and all. So basically, we are still managing. It is a shame to tell that we are still managing migration with the Immigration Act, which was enacted in 1983. You should remember that 90 lakh Indians are working in Gulf countries and we are getting 80 billion US dollars as remittance. We are the largest migrant sending country and the largest remittance receiving country. When I say 80 billion US dollar, it is 6.67 lakh crore, which is 2.5 times higher than the FDI, which Prime Minister's office and other business guys bring in through FDI, through the BRIC meeting, G20 meeting, G10 meeting and all. They bring in the FDI. 2 times higher than the FDI, the remittance is coming up without any effort because these are all monthly wage earners who are remitting the money through the Western Union and through the banks and all. And this money is circulating here and it builds this Indian economy. But unfortunately, we are still managing the migration with the 1983 Immigration Act. So we have to have a new Migration Act, adapting the new changes and trends and everything happening. In that new Migration Act or in making a setting of a migration policy, we should also think about reintegration. We should be prepared when something happens. Okay, I will tell you the reintegration part as an example. In Philippines, when this COVID crisis happened in the Gulf country, when the Filipino migrant workers were returning, the Philippine government strictly told the private sector that reserve the jobs for the migrants who are coming back. In Nepal, what they did, in the Nepal, the government employment list, they said that give preference to the migrants who have come back from the Gulf losing job. Give them the job first. Let them get the job first. Later on, we will give for. In Bangladesh, when the migrants who returned from COVID during COVID from the Gulf, upon the arrival in the airport, they were given 5,000 taka, the Bangladeshi rupee, in hand, and they are being provided 2.5 lakh taka as loan to set up any small scale industry or whatever it is. What did India government do? India government just picked the stranded migrant workers from the Gulf, and that too for picking, they took 13,000 Indian rupees per ticket. When we talk about the fishermen who came back, I had to find money for the fishermen who didn't have money to buy the ticket to sail on an Indian Navy ship. How shame it is. I am an Indian citizen, an Indian Navy ship is coming to rescue me, and I have to pay them in dollars to get on board that ship. I had to raise money for a few fishermen. I had to talk to a few good friends in the Gulf, and they started to remit money to the stranded fishermen. And with that money, they paid aboard the Indian Navy ship ticket, and they came back home. So, and when while returning, we don't have any proper reintegration plan. We don't have any loan schemes. We don't give any of the preferences. And at the age of 45, when you return, I'm 43. I came back when I was 40. At the age of 40, do you get a job in India? You won't get a job in India. And so, and
45
see,
later.
yeah, and even though, see, even when coming back, you can give a training program to upgrade the skill and help them to re-migrate. That also is not happening.
But again,
So
Kerala is spearheading this by having the non-resident Keralite Welfare Fund,
that is
Welfare
there.
Act.
See,
That's indeed very great.
yeah, indeed, very great. But what I feel is that with 2.21 lakh crore remittance getting state Kerala, which is some 30% of what total India remittance gets, and through which we have benefited a lot since the beginning of 1980s. All the education, health status, literacy, everything was through the Gulf money which came in here. So we are not supposed to just stuck with this Norca. We are supposed to move ahead, far ahead. We are stuck somewhere here. When it comes to the programs implemented on the ground, we are failing. We are failing. Norca has a good pre-departure program and all, but that is not reaching out to people. Still, there are Keralites who get duped by the agents after paying 1.5 lakh and all. So that's what I say. This in this book also I'm talking about these kind of things and all. What are the pitfalls of migration? How do we fail? And what can the Indian government, Kerala government can do? And during COVID and all, how the workers struggle. Through their struggle, I am exposing the shortfalls of the government. See, during COVID, the migrant worker was helped by individual, not the institution. Institutions had to step in. They didn't do that. Even in internal migrants also. See, somebody was sending them food, somebody was buying them flight ticket, somebody was buying them train ticket. But the institution in a all, they failed. They were sleeping. They woke up late. So that's what I'm telling in my last chapter also. Empty return, all return empty-handed. I took data, I took RTI data and everything. In that I'm saying that how the institutions failed, and that I'm telling through the struggles of the real life people.
So to sum up, in India, basically domestically, we want to have this very sharp and strong regulatory framework. So also on the international circuit, we have to be that strong because India, I'm sure, is failing on that part. Kindly, if you can throw some light on that.
Yeah, on the migration level, see, as I said, the largest migrant sending country, largest migrant.
Nepal and Bangladesh have done for their own nations. Sorry to
Yeah, they have done a lot, but when we compare to them and when we see them what they're doing, I feel ashamed. Even my neighbor, small country, Himalayan country, they have done a great job having a migration policy. And Dhaka, Bangladesh, everybody sees them still as a third world country, but they have moved far ahead than India. And then Sri Lanka also, Sri Lanka, Philippines. They all are recognizing the importance of labor migrants, what they can do to their own economy, home economy, and their contribution at all. But in India, I feel that we are not focusing more on the labor migrant. And for the namesake, we hold this Pravasi Bharati Divas. In Kerala, we have a replica of the same called Loga Kerala Sabha and all, where all the money has been thrown away, the government money has been thrown away, where only a little welfare measures are being discussed for the namesake. And in the global meetings and all, definitely diplomats and experts are coming and they are talking, and I see them also. But we are still in 1983. That's still in that 1983 Immigration Act. And after 1993, we have not signed any global tools or anything. So again, we are falling short on that global conventions. And though protection that conventions would give us, we are falling short on that. Recently also, we signed a GCM, Global Compact for Migration, and we signed it, but it's not a legally bound document. So it's not going to help us. It's not going to help us. So see, we should, the government of India should open its eyes and see that, see, our people are going out because we are not able to give them proper jobs here. Maybe it's poverty, unemployment, climate crisis, or political tensions. I even know a migrant who migrated from UP due to political crisis. Due to political crisis. So many driving forces are there for Indians to migrate. I met a shepherd, Indian shepherd, in Kuwait-Iraq border. He's from Poonch area. He's from Poonch area. I asked him, why did you migrate from Poonch area to desert? He said, sir, if I am there, I should either be an informer for army or be a supporter of terrorist or the rebel.
Kashmir, typical.
Whatever it is, 5 years, 10 years, I'll be shot at by either one of them. So we lost one of our brother like that. So my mother wanted to leave that city, leave that country. So I thought that I'll get a good job as a domestic worker in Kuwait. But in Kuwait, Indian Shepherd visa is banned. Indian Shepherd visa is banned. So what happened is that they recruit us as a domestic worker, and the next day when we land there, they'll put us in the desert somewhere. And there, even if we fall sick, the employer will come only on Friday with some medicine. We only get dal, rice, one table fan, and 100 sheep. That's it. So that's also, these kind of driving forces are there in India for labor migrants. We should think seriously about it. We should have a proactive role. We should have a humanitarian attitude to the labor migrants.
Yes. So I'm sure the book, the light that you've thrown on so many aspects right now, and also through your book, I'm sure that is definitely going to benefit. And I'm sure after this talk today, I feel that there's a lot of awareness and there's a lot of inquisitiveness now. There are so many fields in which I, as a lawyer practicing at the Supreme Court, I need to see, understand, and work on. So I hope this talk today, after this talk, all of us are in a way not only aware, but also try to emulate things as much as we can. And be more empathetic. That's very, very important.
Yeah.
To sum up, sir, due to paucity of time, I wish we had more time, but now as we have to sum up, I want you to throw light on this new book that you are writing for all of us. So kindly throw some light.
Yeah, I did my first book, that was in 2009. That was about the heroic fisherman who rescued some 60,000 people stranded in the 2018 flood on 600 boats. And Indian government could rescue only, with army, navy, and all, they could rescue only 8,000 people. And these people faced different kind of challenges. There was even casteism in an area where Brahmins were the fishermen who went on the boat were Muslim and Christians, and the Brahmins who were stranded on the second floor of the house, they were not ready to board on this boat because they felt that it might be a bad thing for them. And many interesting stories, many bad stories were there. And then this was there in my mind for 6 years, and I couldn't get time. And then 2020 during COVID, while attending all these cases of, I was able to bring back 1,400 people during COVID from Gulf countries. And I was able to support 340 people with the airfares, which was sponsored by my friends who are rich people there in the Gulf. It's not needed to be big rich, because to sponsor 10 tickets, it's 1,30,000. And the money the businessmen there they earn is very big. So it's not for my goodwill they have supported. And that book was written in 6 months. And now I'm working on a third book. That's about a sister Abhaya who was found dead in a well 28 years ago. She was a Roman Catholic. She belonged to a sect of Roman Catholic, and she was a nun, and she was very young, and she was found dead in a well. And there was a petty thief, local thief there in that area who witnessed, who is the PW3, and he didn't change his stand even after being even after being tortured in the police station for 62 days continuously, jail for 2.5 years, and in between CBI, crime branch, everybody would pick him up and beat him up, and just to confess that he did it, but he didn't. And finally in the court he said that no, I saw the two people, the two priests and that nun, with this in that circumstances. That's what he said, and that was proved in the court, and the court was convinced. And so he's still alive. This guy is 62 years old. He can't walk properly because he was tortured like that by the policemen and all. And he's a very small illiterate. He works in the market. He's a trolley puller or something like that and all. He works in a market, and once in a while he was doing theft and all. That was long back when he was young and all. And so the story is about him. Through him, I wanted to tell the Abhaya murder case and all.
That would indeed be very thrilling and very different for me as a lawyer also to read, and I'm sure for everybody. So, sir, thank you so much. It was a highly enlightening talk, and it was really good talking to you. It was sheer privilege. So, I really thank Orange City Literary Festival as well as Amer for conducting this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richa. Thank you, Ame. Thank you.
Uh, At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Regimon Khattapan sir and Advocate Rucha Pandey for joining us today. We wish to get to hear you both again and be equally enlightened as we all are today. And for my dear massive audience, I'm sure that after witnessing this conversation, you all are taking home an enriched version of yourselves, just as I will. Thank you so much for joining with us today. Until I see you again, this is Amay Jangde signing off.
Thank you. Thank you.
Done.
Yeah. Done.
Welcome to Rhizome Group, a vision beyond.